World War II was fought across vast oceans by admirals whose decisions shaped the course of global history. Some commanded single fleets in decisive battles, while others directed entire theaters across years of conflict. In this video, we rank the most consequential naval commanders of the war using a balanced framework that weighs battlefield success, strategic vision, innovation, and long-term impact. Before we begin, it's important to define the scope of this list. This ranking focuses exclusively on operational admirals, those who held combat or theater command during the Second World War, directed fleets in battle, and influenced the course of major campaigns. As a result, a number of well-known senior officers aren't included, not because they were unimportant, but because their roles were overwhelmingly administrative, logistical, or industrial in nature. Admirals like Ernest J. King, Emory Land, and Charles Kennedy Purvis played vital roles in wartime planning, logistics, and production, but their contributions end there. They didn't command fleets or direct battle plans in the field. Their impact was significant and arguably more important, but they fall outside the framework of this assessment, which focuses on combat leadership, strategic execution, and the outcomes of military operations. Number 29, Karol Dohrmann. In early 1942, the Pacific War was spiraling fast. Japan's forces were moving south with remarkable speed, overwhelming Allied positions across Southeast Asia. To resist the advance, four nations, Britain, the US, the Netherlands, and Australia, cobbled together a joint naval task force known as ABDA. It was to defend the Dutch East Indies, and its commander was Rear Admiral Karol Dohrmann, Royal Netherlands Navy. It was a difficult assignment from the start. Dohrmann had to unify ships and sailors from four navies, each with their own doctrines, equipment, and communication systems. He faced a better-equipped Japanese fleet with superior air cover, tighter coordination, and full momentum on their side. On February 27, 1942, in the Battle of the Java Sea, Dohrmann took his combined force into combat. The result was one of the most lopsided defeats of the war. The Allies lost 5 cruisers and multiple destroyers over 2 days. Dohrmann himself was killed aboard HM-LMS De Ruyter, refusing to abandon ship after it was struck by a torpedo. Dohrmann's decision to engage, despite the clear disadvantages, came to symbolize the early war desperation and determination of the Allies. His final radio message, "I am attacking, follow me," captured a moment when unity mattered more than odds. Though he couldn't turn the tide, his leadership earned lasting respect. The Royal Netherlands Navy named ships after him, monuments stand in his memory, and for a brief moment in 1942, Karol Dohrmann embodied the principle that even in retreat, resistance carried meaning. Number 28, Angelo Iachino. When Italy entered the war in 1940, its navy, the Regia Marina, boasted some of the fastest and most modern battleships in Europe. But by 1943, that fleet was largely sidelined. Its strength wasted more by circumstance than cowardice. At the center of that decline was Admiral Angelo Iachino, commander of Italy's battle fleet during its most critical years. He'd served in World War I, was decorated for bravery, and was respected within the Navy for his professionalism. But the war he faced in the Mediterranean was one of limitations. Limited radar, limited air cover, limited fuel, and nearly constant pressure from the Royal Navy and the RAF. His most famous test came in March 1941 at the Battle of Cape Matapan. Iachino took a powerful surface force to sea, hoping to ambush British convoys. But the operation unraveled when ultra intercepts revealed his movements. Worse, the Italians lacked radar, and Iachino was unaware that British battleships were stalking him at night. The result was catastrophic. 3 Italian heavy cruisers were sunk, over 2,300 sailors killed, and the fleet's offensive capability was badly shaken. Despite that, Iachino continued to lead operations through 1942, including the first and second battles of Sirte, efforts to disrupt British resupply of Malta. These actions were tactically cautious and strategically inconclusive, constrained again by a lack of coordination with the Air Force and the inability to match British night fighting capability. Iachino's defenders point to the material disadvantages he faced. He was asked to fight a modern war with outdated doctrine and missing tools. Critics argue he was too risk-averse and too bound by traditional surface fleet thinking. Both views hold weight. By 1943, the Regia Marina was effectively neutralized, its ships bottled up, its initiative lost. Iachino was relieved of command that spring. He survived the war and later wrote detailed, thoughtful memoirs about the Navy's failures and missed opportunities. Angelo Iachino remains a case study in command under constraint. He had courage and competence, but in a theater that demanded innovation and inter-service cohesion, neither was enough. Number 27, François Darlan. A career officer with political instincts, François Darlan was a central figure in one of the most delicate naval dilemmas of World War II, the fate of the French fleet after France's surrender. As Commander-in-Chief of the French Navy, Darlan commanded one of the largest and most modern fleets in Europe at the outbreak of the war. But after the 1940 armistice, he threw his loyalty behind Vichy France, maintaining the fleet in a state of armed neutrality, technically independent but aligned with Axis toleration. His insistence on retaining control of the fleet triggered one of the war's most controversial episodes, the British attack on Mers el-Kabir, where over 1,200 French sailors were killed to prevent their ships from falling into German hands. Darlan's wartime role took a dramatic turn in November 1942. During Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, Darlan happened to be in Algiers. In a surprise move, he ordered Vichy forces to stand down and cooperate with the Americans. The sudden reversal helped prevent a prolonged fight across French North Africa and allowed the Allies to consolidate their position in the region far more quickly than expected. But the gesture was controversial. Darlan was still seen as a collaborator by the Free French and many in the resistance. His alignment with the Allies was viewed more as opportunism than conviction. Weeks later, in December 1942, he was assassinated by a French monarchist, ending one of the war's most enigmatic careers. Darlan wasn't a frontline commander in the traditional sense, but in terms of political impact, his decision in North Africa arguably changed the pace of the war. His legacy remains tangled, part strategist, part survivor, never fully trusted by either side. Number 26, Günther Lutyens. In May 1941, the German battleship Bismarck broke into the Atlantic, trailed by storm clouds and history. At the helm of this high-risk mission was Admiral Günther Lutyens, a veteran officer of the High Seas Fleet, now tasked with leading the most daring surface sortie of the Kriegsmarine's war. His orders were to strike Allied shipping lines in the North Atlantic and disrupt the logistical lifeline between Britain and the Americas. It was a calculated gamble, and the gamble paid off, briefly. On May 24th, in the Battle of the Denmark Strait, Bismarck engaged British capital ships. Within minutes, the Royal Navy's Pride HMS Hood exploded and sank with over 1,400 men aboard. But Lutyens didn't linger. He knew the full force of the Royal Navy would now come for him, and it did. Over the next 3 days, one of the most intense sea hunts in naval history unfolded. Damaged and pursued, Bismarck was eventually cornered. On May 27th, the ship was sunk after a prolonged engagement. Lutyens went down with her, refusing to abandon ship. The sortie was a failure. While Bismarck sank the Hood, she was lost herself. The episode shook the Allied command, forced a vast reallocation of naval assets, and proved that even a single modern surface radar could rattle the Atlantic convoy system. Lutyens was a complex figure, known for his loyalty, professionalism, and personal opposition to Nazism. He refused to perform the Nazi salute aboard his ships and remained a traditional naval officer in an increasingly politicized regime. His leadership was brief but symbolic, and he commanded with calm resolve in a mission that was both bold and doomed from the start. In the cold, grey waters of the North Atlantic, Lutyens led one of the war's most iconic warships into legend. Number 25, Reizo Tanaka. By late 1942, the struggle for Guadalcanal had become a brutal test of endurance. The Japanese, outgunned and stretched thin, turned to speed, stealth, and darkness to keep their forces supplied. At the heart of that effort was Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka, the man behind the so-called Tokyo Express. Tanaka commanded Japan's fast destroyer squadrons in the Southwest Pacific. His mission was as straightforward as it was dangerous: run troops and supplies through narrow, Allied patrolled waters under cover of night. The routes were tight, the risks were enormous, but Tanaka's leadership made it work. He coordinated high-speed nocturnal runs through the slot, using minimal radio traffic, tight formations, and an extraordinary level of discipline. His defining moment came at the Battle of Tassafaronga in November 1942. Facing a superior US force of 5 cruisers and multiple destroyers, Tanaka's smaller force was expected to be overrun. But he struck first, with long-range torpedoes, and within minutes, 4 American cruisers were either sunk or badly damaged. The Japanese, in comparison, only lost 1 destroyer. It was one of the most lopsided naval skirmishes of the campaign, and a painful wake-up call for the US Navy about Japanese night fighting capabilities. Tanaka's tactics extended the fight in Guadalcanal and bloodied a stronger opponent. He understood his ships, trusted his crews, and mastered the art of doing more with less. Later in the war, his methods were studied by both sides. Allied commanders came to respect his aggressive style and use of torpedoes, especially in restricted waters. Even in defeat, Tanaka earned a reputation as one of the most capable destroyer commanders of the Pacific War. Number 24, Gunichi Mikawa. In the dark waters of Guadalcanal, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa delivered one of the most devastating surprises in the history of naval warfare. On the night of August 8th to 9th, 1942, just days after the US landed its first major amphibious force in the Pacific, Mikawa led a cruiser strike force on a bold, high-speed approach through the slot. The result was the Battle of Savo Island, and the worst defeat the US Navy would suffer at sea during the war. 4 Allied heavy cruisers, USS Astoria, Quincy, Vincennes, and the HMAS Canberra, were sunk in under an hour. Hundreds of sailors were killed. The Allied screen had failed to detect Mikawa's approach, and once he opened fire, confusion turned to disaster. Radar, coordination, and air cover were all lacking, and Mikawa's well-drilled gunners exploited every weakness. It was a masterstroke of planning, timing, and aggressive leadership. Mikawa's use of night tactics, maneuver, and concentration of fire caught the Allies completely off guard and delayed their operations around Guadalcanal for weeks. But the victory was incomplete. After the attack, Mikawa chose not to press forward to destroy the vulnerable American transports anchored nearby, ships carrying troops, fuel, and ammunition. Concerned about imminent air attacks at dawn and operating without air support himself, he withdrew. In doing so, he spared the very supply line that allowed US forces to dig in on Guadalcanal. That decision has been debated ever since. Some view it as prudent caution given the air threat. Others see it as a decisive opportunity lost. The Japanese Navy never again had such a clear chance to cripple the Guadalcanal lodgement. Mikawa continued to command the Solomons, but was increasingly sidelined as the tide turned against Japan. After the war, he was critical of the High Command's refusal to prioritize logistics and air support, shortcomings that ultimately doomed the Guadalcanal campaign. His legacy rests on a single night of audacity and skill, one that showed the power of decisive action, but also the cost of hesitation. Number 23. Nikolai Kuznetsov. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in 1942, the Soviet military was caught off guard, except for one branch, the Navy. Thanks to the insistence of a young, determined admiral, the fleet had been quietly placed on high alert hours before the invasion began. That admiral was Nikolai Kuznetsov. At just 36 years old, Kuznetsov was People's Commissar of the Soviet Navy, effectively its top officer. He was a rare figure in Stalin's high command, forward-thinking, politically astute, and unafraid to challenge orthodoxy when it mattered. Against orders, he had mobilized the fleet ahead of the German attack, ensuring that Soviet ships and coastal defenses were ready when much of the Red Army was still reeling. Throughout the war, Kuznetsov coordinated naval support across 3 distinct theaters: the Baltics, Black Sea, and Arctic. His forces helped evacuate besieged Soviet garrisons, defended key ports, and provided cover for the Arctic convoys that brought Allied aid into Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. Soviet submarines and coastal craft harassed Axis supply lines in the Black Sea, while Baltic units operated under near constant siege. Kuznetsov protected what he had, directed what he could, and kept the Navy relevant in a war dominated by land combat. His push for modernization, before and after the war, laid the foundation for the Soviet Navy's transformation into a true blue water force in the Cold War era. After the war, he was named Admiral of the Fleet of the Soviet Union, the Navy's highest rank. Though purged and rehabilitated more than once during Stalin's final years, his reputation endured. Today, Russia's most powerful class of warship is named in his honor, the Admiral Kuznetsov aircraft carrier. Number 22. Henry K. Hewitt. In the European theater of World War II, where land battles often dominated headlines, few admirals had a more consistent operational impact than Vice Admiral Henry Kent Hewitt. Quiet, steady, and precise, Hewitt was the man behind some of the war's most complex and politically sensitive amphibious assaults, from North Africa to southern France. A career officer with early experience in gunnery and destroyers, Hewitt rose to prominence when he was selected to lead the Western Naval Task Force for Operation Torch in 1942. It was the first major American landing of the war and the first test of how US and British forces could operate jointly under real combat conditions. Hewitt's coordination with General Eisenhower and British naval counterparts was a quiet triumph, helping secure a foothold in North Africa with minimal disruption between services. In 1943, he repeated the feat at Sicily and Salerno, navigating everything from German coastal defenses to the friction between British and American commanders. These involved dozens of ships, changing weather conditions, contested beaches, and multinational forces working under shared but strained command. By August 1944, Hewitt was again at the center of the action, this time leading the naval component of Operation Dragoon, the Allied landing in southern France. Though often overshadowed by Normandy, Dragoon was a success, cutting off German forces in western France and speeding up the liberation. Hewitt never sought attention, but his reliability made him a cornerstone of Allied naval planning in the West. His ability to coordinate amphibious operations across cultures, egos, and command structures was rare and essential. Number 21. Soemu Toyoda. By mid-1944, Japan's naval war was already tilting toward disaster. Carriers were hollowed out, fuel reserves were low, and Allied forces were closing in on the Philippines. Into this bleak command environment stepped Admiral Soemu Toyoda, appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet in the summer of 1944. From his headquarters in Tokyo, Toyota inherited a navy in crisis. With few remaining carriers and scattered surface forces, he was charged with defending Japan's empire against a steadily advancing US Pacific offensive. His answer was Operation Shogo, a set of coordinated counterattacks designed to halt the American push at Leyte Gulf. Toyota's plan was bold on paper. Use decoy carriers to lure the US Third Fleet north, while Japan's remaining battleships and cruisers attacked the landing forces from multiple directions. It was a last, desperate gamble to preserve the Philippines and reserve the war's momentum. At Leyte Gulf, parts of the plan briefly worked. The US carriers were drawn off and Japanese surface forces broke through the landing area near Samar, catching American escort carriers and destroyers by surprise. But coordination broke down. The Japanese center force withdrew just as it had gained the upper hand, and elsewhere, Toyota's fleets were mauled by superior US air and naval power. The Battle of Leyte Gulf became the largest naval battle in history and Japan's final naval stand. Its carrier arm was shattered. The remaining battleships were either sunk or sidelined. From that point on, Japan's navy ceased to function as a strategic force. Toyota remained in command through 1945, overseeing plans for homeland defense and authorizing Operation Tengo, the doomed final sortie of Yamato. But by then, the Imperial Navy had little left to give. Though Toyota was experienced, loyal, and methodical, his tenure was defined by declining resources and impossible odds. He didn't lose the war at sea, but he was the man tasked with managing its final unraveling. Number 20. Frank Jack Fletcher. In the critical first year of the Pacific War, when US forces were outgunned, outnumbered, and scrambling to hold the line, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher was at the center of nearly every major naval engagement. A carrier task force commander by necessity, Fletcher found himself pioneering a form of warfare the world had never seen before. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, Fletcher led the US fleet in the world's first carrier versus carrier engagement. Though tactically costly, the battle stopped Japan's attempt to capture Port Moresby, marking the first strategic check on Japanese expansion. Fletcher's leadership helped prove that the US Navy could contest and blunt Japanese momentum. A month later, at Midway, Fletcher again commanded American carriers, this time under even greater pressure. With intelligence from broken Japanese codes and quick decision-making in the heat of battle, the US sank 4 Japanese carriers and turned the tide of the Pacific War. While Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance led the tactical elements under Fletcher's broader command, it was Fletcher who held operational control of Task Force 17, and he bore the responsibility for placing US forces in the right position at the right time. Fletcher's final major action came at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942, part of the Guadalcanal campaign. Again, he helped repel a Japanese thrust, further eroding their carrier strength. But Fletcher's career wasn't without controversy. He was criticized for withdrawing carrier support shortly after the Guadalcanal landings, leaving ground forces without air cover. Some saw it as overly cautious, while others viewed it as a necessary decision given fuel constraints and the vulnerability of the carriers. He was later reassigned and never again held high-level combat command. Still, the record stands. He won the first 3 carrier battles in history at a time when US naval aviation was still finding its footing. In moments when careful judgment was as important as boldness, he delivered the victories that gave the US Navy breathing room to recover and then to dominate. Number 19. Thomas C. Kinkaid. Admiral Thomas C. Kinkaid spent most of World War II in the shadows of bigger personalities, MacArthur, Nimitz, Halsey. But behind the scenes, he played a key role in holding the Pacific Campaign together, especially in the Southwest Pacific, where inter-service coordination was often as difficult as the enemy. Kinkaid made a name for himself commanding the carrier forces in the Aleutians and at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, where he led a hard-fought defense that bloodied both sides. But his defining role came in 1943 when he was appointed commander of the US 7th Fleet, the naval arm of General Douglas MacArthur's command structure. This put Kinkaid in a unique position, running amphibious operations under an army general while coordinating with the broader US Navy. It was a politically delicate job, but Kinkaid made it work. He organized and executed dozens of amphibious landings across New Guinea, the Admiralties, and eventually the Philippines, often under tight timelines and with limited resources. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Kinkaid's fleet bore the responsibility for defending the landing beaches and maintaining sea control around the invasion site. When Japanese surface forces launched their massive counterattack, it was Kinkaid's distributed forces, including battleships, escort carriers, and destroyer escorts, that absorbed the full weight of the southern and center force thrusts. His command held. He was also at the center of the infamous communications breakdown between Halsey's 3rd Fleet and MacArthur's command, which left parts of Kinkaid's 7th Fleet exposed. Though the resulting confusion could have ended in disaster, Kinkaid's scattered units, including the escort carriers at Samar, fought with resilience and helped secure the broader victory at Leyte Gulf. What defined Kinkaid was less battlefield flair and more operational steadiness. He understood how to run a fleet in support of a land campaign, how to build coalitions, and how to manage the politics of high command without losing control of his ships. In a war full of aggressive tacticians, Kinkaid stood out as a practical strategist, focused, reliable, and unshakable in the face of complexity. Number 18. Max Houghton. For most of the war, the Battle of the Atlantic wasn't a fight of great battleships or famous admirals, it was a war of attrition, fought in darkness, silence, and cold. At its peak, German U-boats were sinking Allied ships faster than it could be replaced. Keeping Britain supplied became a question of survival, and in 1942, the man tasked with turning that tide was Admiral Max Houghton. A decorated submarine commander from World War I, Houghton brought a mix of aggression and unorthodoxy to his new role as Commander-in-Chief, Western Approaches Command, the nerve center of Allied convoys operations in the Atlantic. Houghton understood that beating the U-boats would take more than passive escort. He introduced dedicated support groups, fast, well-armed warships that could hunt submarines proactively rather than just defend convoys. He also overhauled routing systems, refined the use of air cover, and improved coordination with Allied naval intelligence, especially ultra-intercepts. The impact was dramatic. In spring 1943, losses dropped, U-boat losses surged, and the Germans were forced to withdraw wolf packs from the North Atlantic. That period, called Black May by the U-boat force, marked the turning point in the campaign. Houghton orchestrated one of the most complex maritime operations of the war. His decisions kept the supply lines to Britain and the Soviet Union open, enabling every major Allied campaign in Europe that followed, from Torch to D-Day. Rarely in view, never flamboyant, Max Houghton was the right admiral for a shadow war, and by 1945, the Atlantic belonged to the Allies again. Number 17. Bruce Fraser. Admiral Bruce Fraser played a key role in both of the Royal Navy's wartime theatres, first defending Britain's home waters, then helping project British power to the far side of the world. As Commander-in-Chief of the Home Fleet from 1943 to 1944, Fraser was responsible for protecting the Arctic convoys and bottling up what remained of Germany's surface fleet. His most notable action came in December 1943 at the Battle of the North Cape. Acting on signals intelligence and tight coordination with escort forces, Fraser positioned his flagship, HMS Duke of York, to intercept and destroy the German battlefield Scharnhorst, a fast, heavily armed radar that had long threatened Allied shipping. With the help of radar and aggressive maneuvering, Scharnhorst was cornered, disabled, and sunk. It marked the end of Germany's surface threat in the Arctic and gave Fraser a reputation as a calm, calculating fleet commander. In 1944, Fraser was reassigned to a much larger stage, the Pacific. As Commander-in-Chief of the British Pacific Fleet, he led the effort to integrate British naval forces into the final campaign against Japan. This required building logistical support across thousands of miles, aligning British procedures with the US Navy doctrine and proving that the Royal Navy could still fight as a global power. Fraser's fleet joined operations in the Okinawa campaign and prepared for the planned invasion of Japan. When the war ended, Fraser was the senior British representative aboard the USS Missouri during the Japanese surrender, a symbolic conclusion to his service across 2 oceans. Bruce Fraser delivered key victories, adapted to new challenges, and helped ensure that Britain's navy remained relevant in a war increasingly dominated by air power and American logistics. Number 16. Takeo Kurita. In October 1944, with the American invasion of the Philippines underway, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita found himself at the center of Japan's last major naval gamble, Operation Shogo, a multi-pronged assault designed to smash the US landing force at Leyte. Kurita's fleet, known as the Center Force, was the strongest element of the plan. It included multiple heavy cruisers, battleships, and the largest warship ever built, Yamato. Kurita had a difficult route to Leyte Gulf. His force was spotted and attacked repeatedly in the Sibuyan Sea, where he lost the powerful Musashi to waves of US carrier aircraft. Temporarily turning back, he regrouped and then pushed through the San Bernardino Strait, arriving off Samar on the morning of October 25th. There, Kurita's forces stumbled upon Taffy 3, a lightly defended task unit protecting the invasion fleet. It comprised a few destroyer and destroyer escorts, along with escort carriers. What followed was one of the most desperate and heroic actions in naval history. Despite overwhelming firepower, Kurita's fleet was thrown into confusion by aggressive US counterattacks, smokescreens, torpedo runs, and relentless air sorties from unarmored carriers. Kurita managed to sink multiple American ships, but then made the most debated decision of his career. He turned back. With the American invasion fleet within reach and his force still largely intact, Kurita chose to withdraw, fearing further air attacks, fuel shortages, and a possible trap. That decision remains controversial. It marked the end of Japanese hopes to contest Allied landings in the Philippines. It denied Japan what could have been a shattering blow to US logistics and amphibious forces. After the battle, Kurita defended his actions as a judgment call made under extreme pressure and incomplete information. His withdrawal may have spared lives, but it also sealed the fate of Japan's surface navy. Takeo Kurita didn't lack courage. He'd already survived submarine attacks, air raids, and the loss of his flagship, but in the Pacific's final, decisive sea battle, hesitation outweighed opportunity, and his name became linked to one of the war's great what-ifs. Number 15. Richmond K. Turner. If there was an American admiral behind every major Pacific island landing, it was Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner. As commander of amphibious forces in the Pacific, Turner orchestrated the complex, grinding process of getting troops from ship to shore again and again, across thousands of miles of hostile ocean. He began with Guadalcanal in 1942, the first major US amphibious assault of the war. It was messy, under-resourced, and fought under constant pressure from Japanese air and sea power. But Turner stayed committed, adapting to the learning curve in real time. That campaign laid the foundation for a new kind of naval warfare, one where land, sea, and air had to move in concert. Over the next 3 years, Turner planned and led nearly every major US amphibious operation in the Central and South Pacific: Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. These were massive joint operations involving thousands of ships, aircraft, and personnel. Turner's job was to make sure they unfolded in sequence and under fire. He was methodical, exacting, and sometimes abrasive, but his planning was thorough and his instinct for coordinating fire support, logistics, and landing waves was second to none. He worked closely with Marine and Army commanders, ensuring that pre-landing bombardments were timed correctly, routes were charted, and naval gunfire was available when ground forces stalled. Turner didn't seek combat glory. His ships rarely traded fire with enemy fleets, but his impact was operationally decisive. Without secure landings, the island hopping strategy would have collapsed. Without Turner's attention to timing, tonnage, and terrain, the path to Japan would have looked very different. He ended the war as a 4-star admiral, having overseen more amphibious invasions than any other naval officer in US history. Behind every hard-won beachhead, there was Turner, coordinating the chaos one landing at a time. Number 14. Jisaburo Ozawa. By 1944, the Japanese carrier force, once the terror of the Pacific, was a shadow of its former self. Outnumbered, outgunned, and lacking trained aircrews, it could no longer match the striking power of the US Navy. Yet, at the helm of what remained stood Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, the last commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy's mobile fleet. Ozawa was a career officer, respected for his intellect, composure, and loyalty. He understood Japan's worsening position and still took the fight to sea. In June 1944, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where his fleet attempted to halt the American push toward the Marianas, he was outmatched in aircraft and pilot quality, though still, Ozawa's carriers launched repeated strikes only to be decimated by US fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The result was the infamous Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, in which Japan lost over 300 aircraft in a single day. Ozawa's fleet was left with decks, but no planes. Despite the defeat, he remained in command and played a key role in the desperate plan known as Operation Shogo during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Ozawa led the Northern Force, a decoy fleet built around Japan's few remaining carriers, deliberately baiting the American Third Fleet northward. The ruse worked. Admiral Halsey pursued Ozawa's empty carriers, leaving the San Bernardino Strait temporarily exposed, and nearly allowing a Japanese surface force to strike the US invasion fleet at Leyte. Ozawa lost all 4 carriers under his command in the battle, but the operation succeeded tactically as a diversion. It was Japan's final throw of the dice, and it left the carrier fleet broken beyond repair. Ozawa's legacy is complex. He was a thoughtful, capable commander placed in a losing position, executing plans he likely knew had no long-term chance of success. He fought with what he had, and in doing so, became the last admiral of Japan's carrier era. Number 13. Mark A. Mitchell. Few admirals did more to shape the way navies fight in the modern era than Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitchell. As commander of Task Force 58, the US Navy's fast carrier force, Mitchell helped perfect the tactics of naval aviation and turned the aircraft carrier into the central weapon of American sea power. Originally a naval aviator in the 1920s, Mitchell came to his wartime command with decades of experience in aviation and carrier operations. But it was in 1944, during the Central Pacific Campaign, that this leadership truly defined the next phase of naval warfare. He oversaw massive, coordinated strikes against strongholds like the Marshall Islands, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, often operating hundreds of miles from shore-based support. Mitchell's most famous moment came during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, known for its devastating US victory in the air, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Under his direction, American carrier groups launched wave after wave of disciplined, coordinated sorties that shredded Japan's remaining naval air power. Nearly 600 Japanese aircraft were downed in 2 days. Mitchell's crews returned to the carriers with minimal losses. During that battle, when returning aviators struggled to find their carriers at night, Mitscher made the risky decision to turn on deck lights, exposing his fleet to potential submarine attack to help save lives. It worked, and the gesture cemented his reputation as a commander who understood both the scale and the human cost of war. Mitscher's influence extended beyond individual victories. The carrier task force model he helped develop, mobile, flexible, and centered on sustained air superiority, became the blueprint for post-war naval strategy. His operations provided the backbone of amphibious advances across the Central Pacific, and his air groups neutralized threats long before troops hit the beaches. He rarely spoke in public and often preferred the bridge to the spotlight. But among those who served with him, Mitscher was regarded as steady, smart, and unshakably calm. When people talk about how the US Navy went from reeling in 1941 to dominating the Pacific by 1945, Mitscher's carriers were the reason why. Number 12. Charles A. Lockwood. While carrier battles captured headlines and amphibious assaults dominated strategy, much of Japan's defeat was engineered beneath the surface. And no one did more to weaponize that dimension of the war than Vice Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, commander of the US Submarine Force Pacific Fleet. When Lockwood took over in early 1943, the submarine campaign was struggling. American boats were brave, but hamstrung by technical failures, most notably faulty torpedoes that routinely missed or failed to detonate. Lockwood forced the issue, pushing through tests that confirmed the problems and demanding rapid fixes from the Bureau of Ordnance. Once those weapons started working as intended, Lockwood's submarines became the silent arm of strangulation. He encouraged aggressive patrols deep into enemy-controlled waters, targeting merchant ships, oil tankers, troop transports, anything that kept Japan's war machine moving. Under his command, US submarines accounted for roughly 55% of all Japanese shipping losses. The numbers tell the story. Over 1,300 Japanese ships were sunk, including 8 aircraft carriers and more than 200 warships. By 1945, Japan's economy was collapsing. Its fleet was starved of fuel, and its logistical lifelines had been cut, largely thanks to Lockwood's submarines. He was fiercely loyal to his crews and unafraid to challenge Washington. When enemy patrol reports were ignored or dismissed by higher-ups, Lockwood made sure submarine voices were heard. He pushed for better training, improved equipment, and more flexible tactics, transforming what had been an underused fleet into a strategic sledgehammer. Lockwood never commanded surface fleets or oversaw major amphibious assaults, but his leadership behind the scenes broke the back of Japanese logistics and hastened the war's end. Victory in the Pacific came from many fronts. His was silent, relentless, and absolutely decisive. Number 11. Erich Raeder. At the outbreak of World War II, the Kriegsmarine wasn't built for global war. It was small, incomplete, and facing the world's most powerful navy. Yet for the first 4 years of the conflict, its direction rested with Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, a career officer who had risen through the ranks of the Imperial German Navy and helped rebuild Germany's fleet in the interwar years. Raeder served as Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine from 1935 through early 1943, making him the longest-serving naval chief of the major powers during the war. He had little time to shape the navy he wanted, a blue water fleet centered on capital ships, but he made the most of what he had. His early strategy leaned heavily on commerce raiding, using surface ships like the Admiral Graf Spee, Scharnhorst, and Gneisenau to harass British shipping in the Atlantic. Though ultimately unsustainable, these raids caused disruption and forced the Royal Navy to spread its resources thin. Raeder's most successful campaign came in 1940 with the invasion of Norway. He strongly advocated for the operation, seeing control of Norway as critical to protecting iron ore shipments and securing bases closer to the Atlantic. It was a costly operation. Germany lost multiple destroyers and its only heavy cruiser in the region, but it succeeded. Norway remained in German hands for the rest of the war. But Raeder's vision clashed with the realities of Hitler's war. He opposed diverting naval resources to coastal defense and objected to the overemphasis on U-boat warfare at the expense of surface ships. Tensions with Hitler increased after the loss of the Bismarck and failed sorties like Operation Rheinübung. By January 1943, Raeder resigned, replaced by Karl Dönitz, who took the Navy in a radically different direction. Raeder was a serious naval thinker, deeply strategic, doctrinally conservative, and committed to building a navy that could challenge British power. In the end, that vision was overtaken by political interference, shifting priorities, and the rise of the submarine campaign. He was tried at Nuremberg, convicted for his role in aggressive war planning, and imprisoned until 1955. But as the architect of Germany's naval war in its opening chapters, Erich Raeder left a lasting, if complicated, legacy. Number 10. Choichi Nagumo. Few admirals began the war with a more decisive impact than Vice Admiral Choichi Nagumo. As commander of Kirobutai, Japan's elite carrier strike force, Nagumo oversaw the opening blow of the Pacific War, the attack on Pearl Harbor, an operation that stunned the world and reshaped naval warfare overnight. On December 7, 1941, Nagumo directed 6 aircraft carriers north of Hawaii, launching over 350 aircraft in a surprise strike that crippled the US Pacific Fleet. Battleships were sunk or disabled, airfields destroyed, and over 2,400 Americans killed. It was a tactical masterpiece of planning and execution, coordinated with long-range submarine screens and radio deception. But Nagumo, cautious by nature, chose not to launch a third wave targeting oil reserves and dry docks, facilities that would later prove essential to the US Navy's recovery. In the months that followed, he continued to lead Kirobutai in a series of sweeping operations. His carriers raided the Indian Ocean, sinking British cruisers and the aircraft carrier Hermes, and threatening British supply lines to the Middle East. At that point, Japanese naval air power seemed unstoppable. But the war changed, faster than Nagumo did. At Midway in June 1942, Nagumo suffered a catastrophic defeat. Caught off guard by US carrier forces and hampered by a complicated strike rearming process, he lost 4 fleet carriers in a single day: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with hundreds of irreplaceable aircrew. Midway ended Japan's carrier supremacy and began a slow, grinding reversal of fortunes. Nagumo stayed in combat, but he never recovered the initiative. He later oversaw land-based air units during the defense of the Mariana Islands, and ultimately died by suicide during the fall of Saipan in 1944. Nagumo had risen through the ranks as a gunnery officer and was handed the carrier fleet late in his career, at a time when naval aviation demanded a new kind of thinking. His early victories were as much a product of Japan's doctrine and pilot skill as his own command style. Still, his name is forever tied to the most audacious carrier operation in history and to the turning point that followed. Number 9. James Somerville. Admiral James Somerville was a measured strategist, trusted by Churchill, and handled some of the most politically sensitive and operationally complex commands of the war. Whether confronting the French Navy at Mers el-Kabir or outmaneuvering Japanese carrier forces in the Indian Ocean, Somerville navigated challenges that required both precision and restraint. In 1940, he took command of Force H, a fast reaction squad based in Gibraltar. Almost immediately, he was given a grim task: neutralize the French fleet at Mers el-Kabir to prevent it from falling into German hands. The operation was controversial. When negotiations failed, Somerville opened fire, sinking one battleship, damaging others, and killing over 1,200 French sailors. It was a stark example of how this war would demand not just tactical skill, but moral calculation. Somerville also played a supporting role in the hunt for the Bismarck, shadowing the German battleship after it broke into the Atlantic in 1941. In 1942, he was reassigned to a much broader and more vulnerable theatre, the Indian Ocean, where he became the Commander-in-Chief of the Eastern Fleet. Faced with a powerful Japanese carrier force during the Indian Ocean raid, Somerville made the difficult choice to avoid direct confrontation. Critics at the time questioned his caution, but in hindsight, his withdrawal preserved his fleet for future operations and avoided a Midway-style disaster in waters where Britain had no immediate way to replace lost ships. He spent the remainder of the war defending Allied interests in the region, coordinating operations across vast distances and maintaining naval presence in a theatre often overshadowed by the Pacific and Atlantic campaigns. Somerville was later promoted to Admiral of the Fleet, the Royal Navy's highest rank, and served as the British military representative in Washington. He was a calm hand in crises and a commander who earned the trust of both Churchill and Roosevelt. Number 8. John Tovey. In May 1941, the most dangerous ship in the Atlantic was on the loose. The German battleship Bismarck, fresh from sinking HMS Hood, was making a run for occupied France. At the center of the effort to stop her was Admiral John Tovey, Commander-in-Chief of the Royal Navy's Home Fleet. As Bismarck tried to break into the Atlantic convoy lanes, Tovey coordinated a wide-ranging response using battleships, cruisers, and carrier-based aircraft. He sent HMS Prince of Wales, HMS Victorious, and later brought in HMS King George V, his flagship, for the final confrontation. When Bismarck was crippled by airstrikes from the carrier Ark Royal, Tovey closed in. On May 27th, his battleships opened fire. Bismarck was eventually sunk after a prolonged engagement. The Kriegsmarine lost its most powerful surface ship, and the threat to the Atlantic convoys dropped sharply. Tovey's performance in the Bismarck operation reflected the best of steady naval command, effective delegation, calm decision-making, and no appetite for drama. He later pushed back against criticism of his subordinates, most notably defending Captain Leach and Admiral Wake Walker from bureaucratic blame. Beyond Bismarck, Tovey's home fleet played a critical role in protecting the Arctic convoys, the lifeline to the Soviet Union. Operating in brutal conditions, Tovey managed scarce resources and constant threats from U-boats, Luftwaffe aircraft, and German surface ships based in Norway. He was promoted to Admiral of the Fleet before retiring in 1946. He largely avoided the public spotlight, but among Royal Navy officers, Tovey was respected for his strategic clarity, sense of duty, and refusal to seek personal credit. In the cold waters of the North Atlantic, John Tovey delivered when it counted. Number 7. Bertram Ramsay. In the Allied war effort, few men did more to make vast, complex operations work. Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay was a master of coordination, the architect of Amphibious war in Europe and the naval mind behind two of the most consequential operations of the entire conflict, Dunkirk and Normandy. In 1940, Ramsay was living in retirement. He had left the Royal Navy years earlier, but with the fall of France imminent and the British Army cornered at Dunkirk, he was urgently recalled to service. His task was daunting. Organize a rescue of nearly 400,000 Allied troops under fire, with almost no time, limited naval resources, and the Luftwaffe overhead. Operating from a converted communications room inside Dover Castle, Ramsay launched Operation Dynamo. Over the course of 9 days, he cobbled together a rescue armada of destroyers, minesweepers, fishing boats, ferries, and anything that could float. Against the odds, 338,000 troops were evacuated. It was a logistical improvisation under fire, and it worked. But if Dunkirk was a miracle of necessity, his next great contribution would be a miracle of planning. By 1944, Ramsay was the Allied naval commander-in-chief for the Normandy invasion, the man responsible for moving the largest amphibious assault force in history across the English Channel and onto the enemy beaches. The job demanded diplomacy, engineering, forecasting, and nerves of steel. Ramsay had to coordinate more than 7,000 vessels and nearly 200,000 naval personnel drawn from 8 different nations in a precise choreography of convoys, bombardments, landing waves, and supply echelons, all while facing enemy fire and the unpredictable conditions of the sea. On June 6, 1944, Operation Neptune, the naval component of D-Day, went forward with Ramsay's signature all over it. Minesweepers cleared the approaches, battleships and cruisers pounded German coastal defenses, and landing craft delivered the first waves of Allied soldiers into fire-swept surf. The landings succeeded, the beachheads held, and Ramsay's system, built over months of planning, carried the weight of it all. He had already applied this meticulous approach in earlier amphibious operations, including Torch in North Africa and Husky in Sicily. Those landings provided the live testing ground for what would become the D-Day blueprint: multinational forces, integrated command, and overwhelming naval presence. Tragically, Ramsay was killed in a plane crash in January 1945 en route to a planning meeting in Brussels. He had no time to write memoirs or campaign for recognition. But among the Allied command, there was no doubt about what he had accomplished. Eisenhower considered him essential. So did Mountbatten, who had once been Ramsay's subordinate. Ramsay delivered the fleets to battle, on time, under fire, across oceans and continents. His command was in the timing, the tides, the convoys, and the landing craft. And in that quiet precision, he helped change the course of the war. Number 6. Raymond A. Spruance. Admiral Raymond Spruance was one of the most quietly effective commanders of the Second World War, a man who, more than once, made decisions that shaped the entire Pacific campaign. Spruance's rise to prominence came suddenly. In June 1942, he was a cruiser commander temporarily placed in charge of Task Force 16 when Admiral Halsey fell ill just days before the decisive Battle of Midway. Thrust into a high-stakes command on short notice, Spruance found himself overseeing half the US carrier force in a battle that would define the course of the war. At Midway, Spruance showed the blend of discipline, clarity, and nerve that would become his signature. Acting under the broad direction of Admiral Fletcher, he made the critical decision to launch his airstrikes early based on incomplete information, just early enough to catch the Japanese carriers while they were vulnerable. The result was one of the most stunning reversals in naval history. 4 Japanese carriers sunk and Japan's offensive momentum shattered. 2 years later, now commanding the US Fifth Fleet, Spruance faced his next great test in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Here, he faced Admiral Ozawa's remaining carrier strength in a last-ditch Japanese effort to defend the Marianas. In a 2-day engagement, US pilots downed over 600 enemy aircraft in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Spruance's calm command style held. He protected the invasion of Saipan and maintained tight control over his task groups. Critics argued he was too cautious, particularly for not pursuing Ozawa's retreating carriers more aggressively. But Spruance made a calculated choice. The priority wasn't chasing ships, but securing the beachhead. The Philippine Sea was won and the landings held. Risk was weighed and avoided when it didn't serve the broader objective. In 1945, Spruance directed operations at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, commanding what was possibly the largest naval force in history. More than 1,500 ships under his control during the Okinawa campaign. The scale of logistics, coordination, and sustained support required to execute these operations was staggering. He did it with the same quiet resolve he'd shown at Midway. Spruance's strengths weren't always visible in the moment. He didn't project the same aggressive energy as Halsey, his counterpart in the rotating 5th/3rd Fleet structure. But Nimitz himself saw them as a perfectly balanced team. Spruance the thinker, Halsey the striker. Together, they gave the Pacific Campaign both its muscle and its brain. After the war, Spruance served as Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, President of the Naval War College, and later as US Ambassador to the Philippines. Many, including senior officers, believed he deserved promotion to Fleet Admiral, a 5-star rank. But Spruance never complained, never lobbied for recognition. His record spoke for itself. He never lost a major battle, not once. In the Pacific, he was the model of calm command, unshakable in crisis, focused on objectives, and almost always right. Number 5. William F. Bull Halsey Jr. No admiral of the Second World War embodied the offensive spirit of the US Navy more than William F. Bull Halsey. Brash, aggressive, and relentlessly energetic, Halsey was a symbol. To his men, he was a fighting admiral who took the war to the enemy. To the public, he was a headline hero, but beneath the slogans and sea spray was a commander who shaped the course of the Pacific War at every stage. Halsey came to prominence in 1942, launching early carrier raids in the South Pacific that gave the American public hope in the bleak months after Pearl Harbor. That same year, he was appointed commander of the South Pacific area, taking over just as the brutal campaign for Guadalcanal was underway. It was one of the most difficult commands of the war, an under-resourced theater with a tenuous foothold on land and no guarantee of success at sea. Halsey brought urgency and confidence to the fight, directing key naval battles like Santa Cruz and Guadalcanal and helping to wear down Japanese strength in the Solomons. It was during this campaign that he cemented his reputation as a combat leader willing to take risks. By 1944, Halsey was given command of the US Third Fleet, alternating with Spruance in the Navy's two-fleet system. His style was unmistakably bold: carrier sweeps, bombardments, and full-speed chases. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Halsey saw a decoy Japanese carrier force to the north and raced after it, leaving the invasion beaches briefly exposed. The decision remains controversial. The Japanese center force broke through the San Bernardino Strait and nearly attacked the landing fleet. But even with that misstep, Halsey's forces played a decisive role in destroying Japan's naval strength, and the overall result at Leyte was a clear Allied victory. In the final months of the war, Halsey's fleet ravaged the Japanese home islands, striking airfields, ports, and shipping lanes with impunity. His fast carrier groups became the dominant power in the Western Pacific. But his command wasn't without flaws. In both December 1944 and June 1945, Halsey's fleet was caught in devastating typhoons, storms that inflicted serious losses in men and ships. Critics questioned his judgment, but investigations ultimately cleared him of negligence. Still, Halsey's record remained strong. He was present at the Japanese surrender in Tokyo Bay, standing alongside Nimitz and MacArthur aboard the USS Missouri. By war's end, he had risen to the Navy's highest rank, Fleet Admiral. Halsey's style was loud, forceful, and occasionally impulsive, but it was effective. His leadership during the Guadalcanal campaign, his command over massive carrier formations, and his deep influence on naval morale and momentum all place him squarely in the top 5. He was more than a fighter. He was a figurehead for American resolve at sea. Number 4. Karl Dönitz. Of all the campaigns waged across air, land, and sea in World War II, few matched the strategic stakes of the Battle of the Atlantic, and no single commander had more influence on that front than Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz. A former U-boat officer in World War I, Dönitz was a true believer in the potential of submarine warfare. Long before the war began, he developed and refined the Rudel tactic, or wolfpack tactic, in which groups of U-boats would coordinate attacks on Allied convoys, overwhelming their defenses with sheer volume and surprise. It was an approach rooted in the idea that disruption, not confrontation, was the key to naval victory. From 1939 to 1942, it nearly worked. Operating from bases in Germany, Norway, and eventually France, Dönitz's U-boats inflicted enormous damage on Allied shipping. During the height of the campaign, what came to be known as the Happy Time, his submarines sank hundreds of thousands of tons of merchant shipping per month. Tankers, freighters, troop transports, all were targeted, all were fair game. The goal was simple: starve Britain into submission. At one point, the campaign came dangerously close to succeeding. Britain's reserves of food, fuel, and raw materials fell to the brink. As Winston Churchill later wrote in his memoirs, "The only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." But in 1943, the balance began to shift. Allied improvements in air coverage, radar, direction finding, and ultra code breaking began to close the U-boats' hunting grounds. Escort carriers and long-range patrol bombers filled the once deadly mid-Atlantic gap. Convoys were better protected, and U-boat losses surged. That same year, Dönitz replaced Erich Raeder as Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine, gaining full control of the German Navy. It was a symbolic promotion. Submarines were now Germany's only real remaining naval weapon. Yet, Dönitz remained committed to the U-boat war even as the tide turned. He oversaw the rush deployment of new technologies, including the advanced Type 21 U-boats, but they arrived too late to change the outcome. Though his strategic campaign ultimately failed, the impact of Dönitz's submarine war was enormous. It forced the Allies into a massive industrial, scientific, and tactical response, shaping naval doctrine for decades to come. The convoy system, maritime radar, sonar, and joint naval air coordination all were developed under the pressure he applied. In the final days of the war, after Hitler's suicide, Dönitz was named President of Germany, overseeing the brief transitional government that surrendered to the Allies. He would later be tried and convicted at Nuremberg, not for the U-boat war itself, but for other wartime actions during his leadership of the Kriegsmarine and brief time as head of state. Karl Dönitz understood the strategic value of attrition, disruption, and psychological pressure. His U-boat campaign tied down massive Allied resources, strained shipping networks, and prolonged the war in the Atlantic far longer than many expected. Measured by influence on global logistics, Allied strategy, and wartime innovation, Dönitz earns his place among the top naval commanders of the Second World War, not for what he conquered, but for the threat he forced the Allies to overcome. Number 3. Andrew Cunningham. Few admirals combined battlefield decisiveness with strategic staying power like Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham. Known to his peers and staff as ABC, Cunningham commanded with calm authority and a clear sense of purpose, anchoring the Royal Navy's war effort in one of its most demanding theaters, the Mediterranean. Appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet in 1939, the Italian Navy's entry into the war in 1940 gave Cunningham a lot of challenges. Italy's navy, the Regia Marina, was modern, well-positioned, and backed by Axis air power. But Cunningham moved to seize the initiative. In November 1940, he authorized one of the most audacious operations in naval history: a nighttime airstrike by carrier-launched Swordfish biplanes against the Italian fleet at Taranto. The attack crippled 3 battleships in harbor with just 21 aircraft. It was the first successful carrier strike on a fleet in port, and a tactical blueprint for what the Japanese would later attempt at Pearl Harbor. A few months later, in March 1941, Cunningham personally commanded the fleet during the Battle of Cape Matapan, where the Royal Navy intercepted and destroyed a large Italian cruiser force attempting to harass Allied shipping. With decisive use of radar-directed night attacks, Cunningham's forces sank 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers with minimal British losses. It was a clear-cut victory that effectively sidelined the Italian surface fleet for much of the war. Cunningham understood the strategic lifelines that kept the war in North Africa going, particularly the fragile convoy routes to Malta. Again and again, Cunningham's ships ran the gauntlet, fending off Axis aircraft, submarines, and surface raiders to keep the island supplied. Malta's survival enabled the interdiction of Rommel's supply lines and helped turn the tide in the desert. In May 1941, during the German airborne invasion of Crete, Cunningham's fleet was hammered by Luftwaffe attacks while evacuating British and Commonwealth troops. Losses were heavy, 3 cruisers and 6 destroyers, but Cunningham refused to pull back. When asked if it was worth risking the fleet for an evacuation, his reply became a legend. It takes 3 years to build a ship. It takes 3 centuries to build a tradition. Later in the war, Cunningham transitioned to a broader Allied role. He served as Naval Commander-in-Chief for Operation Husky, overseeing the amphibious invasion of Sicily, and helped direct follow-on landings in mainland Italy. By late 1943, he was appointed First Sea Lord, the Royal Navy's professional head, marking the culmination of a career that had gone from destroyer skirmishes in World War I to strategic command in the Second. Cunningham was a fleet commander, and a supremely capable one. He knew how to balance aggression with caution, political demands with operational risk, and tradition with innovation. In the war's most maritime-intensive theatre outside of the Pacific, Cunningham ensured that the Royal Navy remained dominant, despite operating under constant Axis pressure and often without clear air superiority. Measured by victories, operational command, and sustained influence across multiple campaigns, Andrew Cunningham was Britain's most important admiral of the Second World War and one of the finest Allied naval leaders of the entire conflict. Number 2. Isoroku Yamamoto. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was the most formidable naval strategist Japan produced in the 20th century, and perhaps the only Axis admiral whose influence matched his Allied counterparts. A veteran of Tsushima, a Harvard-educated observer of US industry, and an early advocate of naval air power, Yamamoto understood the kind of war that was coming long before many in Tokyo or Washington did. As Commander-in-Chief of Japan's combined fleet, Yamamoto designed Japan's opening moves in the Pacific War. He knew Japan couldn't win a prolonged conflict against American industrial power. What he hoped to deliver was a decisive shock, an opening blow that would cripple the US Pacific Fleet, break American morale, and buy Japan time to consolidate its empire. That blow came on December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor was Yamamoto's plan, risky, controversial, and unprecedented. Using 6 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and weeks of silent approach across the North Pacific, Yamamoto's forces achieved complete surprise, destroying or disabling 8 US battleships, sinking or damaging numerous support vessels, and killing over 2,400 Americans. As a tactical success, it was flawless. As a strategic gamble, it was bold, perhaps too bold. The attack failed to destroy US carriers or fuel reserves, and most importantly, it awakened the very enemy Yamamoto had hoped to avoid fighting long term. Yamamoto knew the risks. "I can run wild for 6 months," he warned Japan's civilian leadership, "but after that, I have no expectation of success." The quote was prophetic. In early 1942, Yamamoto's forces surged across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Hong Kong, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, and Burma fell. He launched raids into the Indian Ocean, sinking the British carrier Hermes and forcing the Royal Navy to retreat from Ceylon. At sea, Japanese naval power looked unstoppable. Carrier strikes, fast cruisers, and night fighting destroyers dominated the first half of the war. Yamamoto's navy was at its peak. But Yamamoto knew that a reckoning was coming. In June 1942, seeking to draw out and destroy the remaining American carriers, he launched a complex operation to seize Midway Atoll. It was, in many ways, his masterpiece, a plan designed to lure US forces into an ambush, split their fleet, and break American resistance in the Central Pacific. But American codebreakers had cracked parts of the Japanese plan. When Yamamoto's carriers approached Midway, they were walking into an ambush. In a stunning reversal, US carrier aircraft sank 4 of Japan's frontline carriers in a single morning. It was a catastrophe. The Battle of Midway shattered Japan's carrier strength and permanently shifted the balance of naval power in the Pacific. Still, Yamamoto continued to wield immense influence. He directed operations in the prolonged and bitter campaign for the Solomon Islands, including the brutal fights around Guadalcanal. Though these efforts consumed Japanese resources and yielded little strategic gain, Yamamoto remained committed to breaking US momentum. In April 1943, US intelligence intercepted and decrypted a signal indicating Yamamoto would be touring frontline bases in the Solomons. In a rare operation, allegedly approved by President Roosevelt himself, American P-38 fighters were dispatched on a long-range intercept mission. Yamamoto's plane was ambushed over Bougainville. He was killed instantly. Japan lost its most capable naval strategist at a time when its navy could least afford it. Yamamoto's legacy is complicated. He orchestrated the most audacious surprise attack of the war. He shattered Allied positions across the Pacific in the war's opening phase. He forced the United States to rethink carrier warfare, radar coordination, and naval intelligence on an existential level. But he also presided over Japan's most disastrous loss at Midway and committed to attritional campaigns in the Solomons that bled Japan's strength away. Yet, through all of it, his strategic clarity remained unmatched within Japan's high command. He understood the limits of Japan's economy, the lethality of modern air power, and the urgency of decisive action. In a military culture that often favored idealism and bravado, Yamamoto was brutally realistic, and that realism shaped everything from how Japan fought to how the Allies responded. He never underestimated his enemies, and perhaps that is what made him the most dangerous of all. Number 1. Chester W. Nimitz. Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz won the Pacific with discipline, vision, and quiet control, turning catastrophe into dominance and reshaping the way modern naval war was fought. His was a command not of fleets alone, but of momentum, scale, and long-term strategy. In the days after Pearl Harbor, the US Pacific Fleet was in disarray. Battleships lay gutted in the harbor. Morale was low. Japan had the initiative. On December 31st, 1941, Nimitz took command of an entire theater thrown into crisis. From that point on, every major naval move the United States made across the Pacific carried his signature. His first test came quickly. In May 1942, US forces checked a Japanese advance at the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first naval battle fought entirely by aircraft. A month later, Nimitz's calm use of code-breaking intelligence enabled Midway, one of the most decisive victories in naval history. Outnumbered and facing Japan's most elite carriers, Nimitz entrusted Admirals Spruance and Fletcher to execute a risky ambush. The result was 4 Japanese carriers sunk, and the tide of the Pacific War turned in America's favor. From there, Nimitz began to shape the war's entire arc. He supported the grinding fight at Guadalcanal, even as Japanese reinforcements threatened to bleed Allied strength dry. Then he oversaw a vast and complex island-hopping campaign, choosing not to take every strongpoint head-on, but instead leapfrogging fortified islands, cutting off garrisons, and conserving Allied lives and resources. The plan was simple on paper, but enormously complex in execution. By 1944, Nimitz was directing hundreds of amphibious assaults, carrier strikes, submarine patrols, and logistical convoys all across the vast expanse of the Central Pacific. He empowered subordinates like Raymond Spruance, Mark Mitchell, Charles Lockwood, and Richmond Turner, trusting them to carry out his broader vision. He didn't micromanage, he didn't panic. His command style was marked by confidence and delegation, even in the face of enormous uncertainty. At Philippine Sea, his carriers crushed Japanese naval aviation. At Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, his fleets eliminated Japan's last hope of contesting control of the sea. At Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Nimitz directed the largest amphibious operations of the Pacific War, coordinating thousands of vessels and hundreds of thousands of troops with precision. By 1945, Nimitz was commanding a force of over 2 million men, 5,000 ships and 20,000 aircraft across an ocean larger than the Atlantic and all of Europe combined. No admiral in history had ever controlled a fleet of such scale or one with so many moving parts. And yet, through it all, Nimitz remained grounded. He understood the limits of power and the value of preparation. He embraced carrier warfare, undersea strategy, radar coordination, and cryptographic intelligence well before many others in the Navy had fully adapted. He knew that the old battleship paradigm was gone, and he never looked back. When Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945, it was Nimitz who signed the instrument aboard the USS Missouri, representing the United States Navy. It was a quiet moment, almost understated, fitting for a man whose war was not won by flash, but by relentless clarity of purpose. Chester Nimitz created the conditions for victory everywhere he commanded. His strategic judgment, his command of vast forces, and his unwavering steadiness in the face of chaos make him, without question, the most consequential admiral of World War II. Anyways guys, hope you enjoyed our ranking of the different admirals of World War II. Please keep in mind, this is all subjective and you guys are sure to have your own opinions, so make sure you leave them in the comment section below, as well as which admiral is your personal favorite and why. As always guys, thank you so much for watching and I hope you learned something new.